One evening, a boy named Eliot entered St. Bartholomew Church and was never seen again. A week later, he returned, silent, clutching a dusty journal written by a child who vanished 40 years earlier. Then he began drawing things no one should remember. Blood rituals, faceless figures, names of missing children. When Father Morgan looked into the church's mirror, he didn't see Eliot behind him. He saw himself, older, bleeding, whispering. The sun cast long shadows over the quaint town of Woodpine, Vermont, as the golden hues of late afternoon bathed the steeple of St. Bartholomew Church. Inside, the scent of polished wood and aged incense lingered, a comforting aroma to the parishioners who had just concluded their Saturday service. Among them was 12-year-old Eliot Harper, a quiet boy with tousled brown hair and inquisitive eyes that often seemed to observe more than they let on. Father Thomas Morgan, the church's long-serving priest, noticed Eliot lingering near the altar, his gaze fixed on the statue of the Virgin Mary. The boy's expression was one of contemplation tinged with unease. "Everything all right, Eliot?" Father Morgan inquired, his voice gentle. Eliot hesitated before replying, "I thought I heard some whispering behind the statue, Father. It sounded like a prayer, but different." Father Morgan offered a reassuring smile. "Sometimes the old church plays tricks on our ears. The acoustics can be deceptive." Eliot nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the statue. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Father Morgan secured the church doors and retired to the rectory. The night passed uneventfully, the stillness of the town undisturbed. The following morning, Father Morgan returned to the church to prepare for Sunday Mass. As he entered, a chill ran down his spine. The sanctuary felt colder than usual, the air heavy with an inexplicable tension. Approaching the confessional booth, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, resting on the seat, was a folded piece of paper. Curious, he picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were the words, "I saw something I shouldn't have." Concerned, Father Morgan sought out Eliot, only to learn from his parents that the boy had not returned home the previous evening. Panic set in as the realization dawned Eliot was missing. A search ensued, involving local authorities and townspeople, but no trace of Eliot was found. The only clue, the ominous note left in the confessional. Father Morgan sat in the church office, a cup of lukewarm coffee untouched beside him, as Deputy Miller loaded the surveillance footage onto a clunky old monitor. The morning sun streamed weakly through the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows on the floor, a stark contrast to the heaviness that hung in the air. "This camera faces the entrance to the confessional," Miller said, pointing to a fixed-angle shot showing the hallway just beyond the pews. They watched in silence as the timestamp marked 6:48 p.m. Eliot appeared in the frame, his small frame slightly hunched, hands nervously clasped in front of him. He glanced back once before stepping into the confessional booth. That was the last time anyone saw him. Morgan leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Play it through. Let's see when he comes out." Miller nodded, dragging the playhead forward. Minute after minute passed, the hallway remaining empty. The confessional door never moved. No one entered, no one exited. The camera never blinked. At 9:02 p.m., the motion sensor light flickered off, plunging the hall into grainy black and white stillness. Morgan's stomach sank. "That's impossible," he murmured. "I locked up the church myself. I checked that every child had gone home." Miller rewound the footage and played it again. Eliot in, Eliot never out. No anomalies, no interruptions. Just a single quiet moment that turned into a void. Morgan pressed his fingertips to his temples. "Go back," he said quietly, "just before the light shuts off." Miller dragged the timeline back to 8:59 p.m. and slowed it to quarter speed. The frames ticked by with agonizing delay. Then Morgan flinched. A flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, passed through the edge of the frame. Miller paused it. What was that? He zoomed in, enhancing the shadow in the hallway. It was there for less than half a second, a tall, cloaked figure standing just behind the confessional booth. The shape was distorted, blurred by motion, but its silhouette was unmistakably human, or almost human. The robe was dark and heavy, like the liturgical garments used during Lent, but covered in odd rips and patches. The hood obscured the face entirely. Miller and Morgan exchanged a look. This was never seen live? Miller asked. Nope, Miller confirmed. Our system's old, but it stores everything. Nobody accessed this file. It's time-stamped and encrypted. Then what the hell is that? Miller said nothing. He replayed the sequence again, this time frame by frame. The figure appeared, moved one step closer to the booth, then was gone. No motion trigger activated, no door creaked, nothing else registered. It didn't use the door, Morgan whispered. It just appeared. Miller didn't respond. His hand hovered over the mouse, frozen in disbelief. They rewound the footage again, this time going back to Eliot's entrance. Watch him closely, Morgan instructed. His eyes. On the second viewing, the priest saw what he had missed before. As Eliot reached the confessional door, he turned his head toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. His expression was startled, almost frightened. His lips moved slightly, as though murmuring something to himself. Then, with visible hesitation, he opened the door and stepped inside. There was a pause. The camera kept rolling. Nothing else happened, but Morgan now noticed a strange anomaly, a momentary flicker in the shadow cast by the statue. It moved independently, as if responding to Eliot's presence. There's something wrong with that hallway, he muttered. It's not just the booth. Miller raised an eyebrow. You think he saw that thing? That figure? He's scared before he even stepped in. Miller leaned back in his chair. This place gives me the creeps. It didn't used to, Morgan replied quietly. Not until now. They sat in silence, the weight of what they'd just seen settling into their bones. Do you have any other cameras? Miller asked. Inside the booth, the narthex, anywhere else that could help us see more? Only the sacristy and the main hall, Morgan replied, but nothing faces the inside of the confessional. Maybe we check them anyway, Miller said. Maybe that thing left some kind of trail. Marina nodded reluctantly. All right. As Miller gathered the external drive to make copies, Morgan turned once more toward the frozen image of the cloaked figure on the screen. There was something hauntingly familiar about the shape of the shoulders, the way the robes draped, almost like the vestments from an older era, long since retired. He felt a chill crawl down the back of his neck. You've been here a long time, right? Miller asked suddenly. Ever hear anything about this church being... He pointed at the figure. This is different. Maybe it's a person, Miller suggested. A squatter? A costume? Someone hiding in plain sight? No one could have gotten in, Morgan said firmly. I checked the locks. I did the head count. There was no one else here. Except Eliot, Miller murmured, and now he's gone. Miller stood, walking slowly to the hallway, captured in the footage. It looked exactly the same in person, dim, narrow, innocuous. The confessional sat silently at the end, the same as always. But now, in his mind's eye, he couldn't unsee that shadowed figure standing just beyond its door. He walked toward it, heart pounding. He opened the door and stepped inside. Nothing but the faint scent of incense and old wood, but the air felt wrong. He knelt, closed his eyes, and tried to imagine what Eliot might have seen. A whisper brushed past his ear, not a word, just a breath. He stood up so fast he hit his head on the wooden beam. When he turned around, the booth was empty. Yet he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Back in the office, Miller called out, "Hey, Father! There's something weird on the main hall footage, too. You might want to see this." Morgan didn't respond. He was still staring down the hallway, past the booth, toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. The light from the window caught its eyes just right, giving them a glassy gleam. For a brief moment, he thought he saw. Father Morgan returned to the church office that afternoon with a storm of unease pressing against his thoughts. The image of the cloaked figure still burned into his mind, and the name Eliot echoed with a weight far heavier than any missing child case should carry. As he entered, he found Mrs. Beatrice Hammond waiting patiently in the first pew, a delicate woman in her 80s who'd been attending St. Bartholomew since before he was born. Her frail fingers clutched a rosary, and her eyes glinted with something deeper than mere concern. "Father," she said softly as he approached, "I heard what happened to the Harper boy. I thought you should know. This isn't the first time." Morgan paused, heart skipping. "What do you mean, Beatrice?" She looked up at him, eyes brimming with something with tremulite and dread. "I was 16 in 1983. There was a boy then, too, Elijah Morrell. He went missing one evening after confession. Same booth, same timing. The police never found him. His parents moved away shortly after. Morgan stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Beatrice sighed. "Because I hoped it was coincidence. I wanted to believe we'd left that darkness behind." A long silence passed between them before she continued. "I remember whispers, Father, about things that happened beneath this church. Before your time." Morgan felt the back of his neck prickle. "What kind of things?" "Rituals," she whispered. "Secret ones, in the old catacombs." "There are no catacombs under this church," Morgan said reflexively, but the words tasted uncertain in his mouth. Beatrice's lips curled into a sad smile. "That's what they always said." Morgan didn't respond. Instead, he turned sharply and headed toward the archive room, a dusty chamber tucked behind the sacristy, filled with records, yellowed letters, and brittle folders dating back to the founding of Woodpine. It took nearly an hour of combing through baptismal registries and maintenance logs before he found what he was looking for: Elijah Morrell. The file was thin: a birth certificate, a communion photo, a short note from 1983 marked "Internal Use Only," with Father D. Callahan's name scrawled in the corner. Morgan unfolded it slowly. It was a handwritten summary of Elijah's last confession, dated June 11, 1983. One line stood out immediately. The boy claims to have witnessed something in the Undercroft, an unsanctioned ritual led by masked figures involving Latin chant and the burning of sacramental objects. Highly disturbing. He appeared genuinely shaken. Morgan read it twice, then a third time, before sitting back in his chair. He knew that Undercroft referred to the structural basement beneath some older churches, often unused and sealed off after renovations. St. Bartholomew had been rebuilt in the 50s, but the original foundation dated back to 1894. Most people thought the old crypts had been filled in, but what if they weren't? He rummaged further through the drawer and found a maintenance log from 1967, one that detailed repairs to the lower chambers with a final note in red ink. Entry no longer safe. Recommend full decommission. There were no follow-ups, no inspection logs, nothing. Just a void. He returned to the note about Elijah and noticed a margin scribble: "Filed report to diocese. No action taken." Morgan leaned back, breath shallow. Something had been buried, both literally and institutionally. He took out his notebook and jotted two names: Elijah Morrell, Father D. Callahan, had died in 1991, and no detailed personnel files were available without a court order. But the woman who answered remembered something odd. "You're not the first to ask about him," issuances said. "Someone in 2009 requested the same documents. Didn't leave a name." Morgan felt a shiver. He needed more. He returned to Beatrice, who now sat quietly lighting a candle beneath the statue of St. Jude. "Do you remember anything else about Elijah?" he asked. She looked at him with distant sorrow. "Only that he used to sit right there every Sunday, never missed a day, and the week before he disappeared, he asked me if I believed in holy secrets. I thought it was just a child's question. I told him some things are only for God to know. He looked disappointed, said he already knew too much." Morgan sat with that for a moment, then rose. He walked to the confessional again and stared at the booth's dark interior. "What did you see, Elijah?" he whispered under his breath. That night, when the church had emptied, Morgan returned alone. He carried a flashlight, a crowbar, and Elijah's file. From the structural plans he had found, the access point to the Undercroft should have been near the old utility closet, long since converted into a janitorial supply space. The floorboards creaked beneath his steps. At the back of the closet, hidden behind metal shelving, was a square patch of concrete, slightly darker than the rest. He tapped it. Hollow. Carefully, he moved the shelves and began chipping at the edge. The concrete was old and brittle. After 20 minutes, it gave way. Beneath it, a rusted iron grate lay embedded in the stone, with a ring handle judging from its center. He hesitated, heart pounding, then pulled. The grate creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo from another century. Cold air rushed upward, thick with earth and rot. A narrow set of stairs descended into darkness. Morgan stared into it, flashlight trembling in his grip. The Undercroft was real, And whatever Elijah had seen down there, it had terrified him enough to confess. Enough to vanish. Morgan took one step down, then another, the beam of light flickering against stone walls and faded murals. On the third step, he heard something being dragged. He froze, breath held, heart thundering in his ears. Then he heard the sound again, closer this time, like footsteps, but not quite. Father Morgan backed away from the dark stairwell with his flashlight flickering, and breath caught in his throat, the sound he had just heard still echoing faintly behind him like the tail end of a nightmare. He quickly replaced the rusted grate and pushed the shelving unit back over the entrance, hands trembling as he wiped cold sweat from his brow. Something was below, something that night, unable to sleep and haunted by Elijah's report and the chilling noises beneath the floorboards, Morgan returned to the church's supply storage, hoping to clear his head. But as he reached for a forgotten lamp on a high shelf, the metal bracket gave way, spilling a small cardboard box and sending a smaller, tinted tin container clattering to the floor with a sharp, metallic ring. It bounced once and rolled in a slow arc before stopping near his shoe. Curious, Morgan picked it up. The box was old, rusted at the seams, with faded handwriting across the lid. Confession, Archive 1982. His pulse quickened as he unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in rotting cloth and brittle paper, was a compact reel-to-reel tape labeled June 10 Elijah M., along with a folded envelope stamped for internal clear commitment before heading to the rectory's basement, where the church still kept an old projector and tape deck among obsolete choir equipment. The machine groaned as it powered up, the reel sliding into place with a dry click. Morgan pressed play. The first few seconds were white noise. Then, soft at first, came the sound of breathing, then a boy's voice, trembling, wet with tears. I don't want to lie to God anymore. Please, don't make me go back down there." Morgan froze. The boy, Elijah, sobbed audibly. Perhaps a cross or change. They said it was a secret, that I had to be part of it. But it felt wrong. It felt bad. It wasn't like Mass. Then silence. A long, horrible silence, until a male voice, low, strained, difficult to identify, interrupted. "Elijah, what you saw was not meant for you. That's why you must forget it. Confession cleanses. Confession forgives." "But they were wearing masks," Elijah cried. "They burned the wine. They made us kneel in the dark. One of the girls screamed, but no one helped her." The tape popped and hissed violently for a second before abruptly cutting off. Morgan's hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The boy's fear wasn't imagined. Something had happened. Something orchestrated. Slowly he turned to the envelope from the box and unfolded the document inside. It was a typed letter addressed to the Diocesan Oversight Board dated July 1, 1982. Subject, Father Declan Callahan. The report was clinical but laced with underlying panic. Regret to report increasing irregularities in Father Callahan's conduct. Parishioners have raised concerns regarding unorthodox teachings and closed-door rituals. One child, Elijah Morrell, has reportedly accused Callahan of presiding over unauthorized ceremonies in the church's lower chambers, the access of which is believed sealed since 1967. The letter noted that Elijah's allegations could not be substantiated as the boy vanished before formal testimony could be taken. Due to mounting pressure and psychological deterioration, Father Callahan has been quietly reassigned to St. Alora's convalescent parish, pending further evaluation. His final sermons expressed esoteric themes inconsistent with diocesan doctrine, particularly around the nature of sacrifice and absolution. "We recommend no further investigation to avoid scandal." Morgan read the final line 3 times. "We recommend no further investigation." It was a chilling phrase, cloaked in the language of discretion, but loud in its implications. Someone had known. Someone had decided to keep it quiet. He paced the rectory floor, consumed by the idea that not only had Elijah been telling the truth, but that the institution itself, his own, had buried it. Buried him. In the following days, Morgan found himself obsessed. He spent hours combing through every sermon Father Callahan had left behind. Most were mundane, but one, handwritten in the margins of an old hymnal, caught his attention. It read, "The boy heard the breath of the forgotten. He crossed the veil too soon, but the shadows rejoice in silence, and in silence we are blessed. Morgan copied it down, chills dancing along his spine. The shadows rejoice in silence, he whispered to himself. The church's bell tower echoed that silence in mocking agreement. The next evening, driven by a mixture of horror and duty, Morgan returned to the archive room and found a second tape, unlabeled, half covered in dust. He debated, hands trembling, before sliding it into the deck and pressing play. This time, the audio was distorted. Something was wrong with the speed, but beneath the garbled sounds was the distinct hum of Gregorian chanting. Male voices, droning, low and hypnotic. It was not a hymn he recognized. Between verses he caught fleeting sounds, a moan, a sharp breath, the clatter of chains. And then, unmistakably, the voice of Father Callahan, murmuring in Latin, Hostia sanctificatur, non per lucium, sed per obliviemum. Morgan's high school Latin was rusty, but the phrase chilled him nonetheless. The offering shall be sanctified, not by light, but by forgetting. Then, beneath that, almost imperceptible, a child's voice whimpered, Please, I just want to go home. Morgan stopped the tape. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. These were no longer stories. This was no longer theory. Something unspeakable had occurred beneath this sanctuary. Something institutional. And now, after all these years, it was beginning again. But why now? Why Eliot? He stood, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet echoing louder than it should have. Outside, the sky had turned a slate gray, and a storm was moving in from the east. As Morgan reached to unplug the old tape deck, a final whisper escaped from the speakers without prompting. His name. A child's voice, dry and hollow. The machine was already off. The tape had stopped spinning. The voice had not come from the recording. It had come from somewhere else. Father Morgan stood frozen, staring at the speaker, the echo of his name still ringing in the air, though the tape machine was undeniably silent. He slowly backed out of the rectory basement, heart pounding like a war drum, his breath shallow and irregular. Outside the storm had begun, rain slashing sideways against the church windows like claws, and thunder rolling low and mean across the Vermont hills. The voice had felt real, not recorded, not imagined, real. He needed answers, not theories, not legends, not silence. The files had mentioned shadows and rituals. Elijah's tape had whispered of masks and fire, and now that voice, the way it had said his name, like it was waiting. Determined not to waste another moment, he returned to the nave, scanning the church's structure with new suspicion. Every stained glass window, every tile, every pew held potential secrets. Then his eyes settled on the Virgin Mary statue near the confessional, the same one Eliot had stared at before disappearing, the one with the unnerving eyes that caught light just a bit too vividly. Morgan approached slowly, running his hand along the base, fingers brushing dust and chipped plaster. Then he saw it, a faint line, no wider than a thread, running vertically along the rear panel of the pedestal. He knelt, tapping lightly. Hollow. His breath hitched. It wasn't just a statue base, it was a facade. He rose, retrieved a crowbar from the maintenance closet, and returned, heart slamming against his ribs. With controlled force, he wedged the metal bar into the seam and pried. Dust and flakes of plaster fell in muted cascades, revealing a narrow wooden door, aged and scorched around the edges, clearly sealed long ago and then cemented over. The handle had been removed, but the outline remained. Morgan stared at it for a long moment before pressing his hand flat against the surface. It was cold, unnaturally so. After checking the surrounding structure for support, he began chipping away the remaining seal with the cabinet, the sound echoing strangely in the cavernous silence of the church. Finally, after what felt like an hour of digging and hammering, the door gave a low groan and nudged inward. Dust swirled around him in a slow, choking cloud as the gap widened. A narrow stone stairwell spiraled downward into pitch blackness, the smell of ancient mold and something deeper, something wrong, rising to greet him. Flashlight in hand, Morgan took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The walls were damp stone, slick in places, with old cobwebs sagging from the corners. Each footstep echoed too loud, too long, as if the space below was far larger than it should have been. As he descended, the air thickened, growing colder with each step. Then he reached the bottom. The space opened into a chamber, small but unsettling in its geometry, almost octagonal, but not perfectly so. The angles slightly off in ways the eye didn't like. The floor was layered with dust at least an inch thick, unbroken, untouched for decades. The only furnishing was a crude altar made of stone, stained dark at its center. Morgan shined his light across the walls, where centuries-old murals had been painted and hastily defaced. Beneath layers of soot and decay, he saw half-erased faces, symbols he didn't recognize, and one disturbing image of a robed figure standing over kneeling children. Then, directly above the altar, his flashlight revealed a message etched deep into the wall, each letter carved with trembling precision. The Latin read, "Non ignosicus nobis." He translated instinctively, "He does not forgive us." The words struck him harder than he expected. Who wrote them? Why that phrasing? Why he? Was it God? Or something else? Morgan's throat tightened. The room felt heavy with memory, the air thick like it carried secrets that pressed against the skin. A sudden gust of air blew out of the corridor behind him, though there had been no breeze before, causing the dust to rise and swirl around him like ghosts disturbed. He turned quickly, flashlight flicking over the stairwell. Nothing there, just shadows. Yet something felt closer. He examined the altar again and noticed small indentations along its surface, each the size of a human finger. They weren't decorative, they were worn smooth, as if someone, or many people, had clutched that stone in desperation over and over, perhaps while kneeling. He knelt too, mirroring the position, staring up at the phrase carved in stone. "Does not forgive us." Was it a declaration, a warning, or a confession? His mind wandered to Eliot and Elijah, to Father Callahan and his descent into madness. What had they all seen in this place? What had they done? Then, in the silence, he heard it, a faint, dragging sound, not from the stairwell, from the far wall. He turned the flashlight just as the dust began to settle and exposed a second doorway, sealed with mortar, but not thoroughly. Someone had tried to hide it, but rushed. Morgan moved toward it, pressing his ear to the stone. A thump, a pause, then another, rhythmic. Like something pacing just beyond. The sound of pacing beyond the sealed door never returned, but the memory of it clung to Father Morgan like a fever. He left the crypt that night with his clothes damp and his flashlight flickering, locking the church behind him and swearing not to return alone again. He spent the next days in a haze, barely sleeping, every prayer fractured by a crawling doubt, every mass tinged with guilt. Something was beneath that church, something ancient and festering, and no doctrine he knew could explain what it wanted. He spoke to no one, not even Deputy Miller, whom he avoided purposefully, knowing the man would ask questions he couldn't answer. Then, on the 7th morning after Eliot's disappearance, Morgan received a phone call that stopped him mid-breath. "Father," came the trembling voice of Mrs. Harper, "he's back. Eliot's back." Morgan was already out the door before she finished the sentence. The Harper home was nestled at the edge of the woods, behind Woodpine Elementary, a modest cottage with white siding and a sagging porch. Morgan's car skidded into the gravel drive, and he jumped out before the engine fully stopped. Mrs. Harper met him at the door, face pale, hands shaking. "He walked out of the woods this morning, Father. Just appeared. He hasn't said a word. Won't eat, won't blink." Morgan entered the living room slowly, the air still with a kind of sacred terror. On the couch sat Eliot, hair matted, skin pallid, eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were torn, streaked with dirt and dried blood, but he didn't appear injured. In his hands, clutched like a sacred relic, was a weathered leather-bound journal. "Eliot," Morgan said gently, kneeling beside him. "Can you hear me, son?" No response. The boy stared through him, gaze fixed on something far away, or something close that no one else could see. Morgan reached for the book. His fingers slowly released it, one by one, like letting go of something still breathing. Morgan opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, many stained with water, others smudged by what looked like ink, or perhaps blood. On the inside cover was a name written in a child's looping scrawl, Elijah Morel. Morgan's throat tightened. He flipped to the first full entry, dated April 14, 1983. They brought us in pairs, it began, always two at a time. Said it was a new kind of confession, a cleansing for the soul of the parish. Father Callahan would watch from the shadows. We knelt on stone. The others chanted, "I didn't understand the words." Morgan flipped forward. Another entry, May 2nd, just watches. I think it waits for someone to answer its silence. Morgan turned several pages, the ink more frantic, words pressed hard into the paper. They put the mask on me. It smelled like ash. I wasn't supposed to see the ceremony, but I opened my eyes. I think it saw me too. Now it comes to my bed at night. I wake up with my mouth full of dirt. Morgan felt a wave of nausea. The entries continued, some coherent, others devolving into scrawled lines and symbols he didn't recognize. One final legible entry chilled him to the core. I buried this book behind the statue. If they find me, they can't find this. Maybe one day someone else will read it. Maybe they'll stop at last two doors, though expecting something to enter at any moment. Morgan closed the journal and looked to Mrs. Harper. "Where exactly did he come from?" he asked. "He just appeared at the edge of the woods," Sage said. "Didn't say a word, holding that book. Was there anything else?" "Only that. He hasn't looked away from the church once. Even now, when the windows reflect it, he watches. Like he's afraid it'll vanish, or something will come out of it." That night, Morgan didn't return to the rectory. He stayed in the Harper home, seated across from Eliot, watching the boy as he watched the world. The journal sat beside him, a relic of something far more terrifying than any ghost story. At midnight, Eliot stirred for the first time. He didn't speak, didn't blink, but his hand slowly lifted and pointed at the window. Morgan turned and saw the silhouette of St. Bartholomew in the distance, the steeple cutting into the sky like a blade. A light flickered behind the stained glass window of the Virgin Mary statue just for a moment. Then darkness. Eliot's hand dropped. He resumed his stillness, and when Morgan looked back at the journal, it had fallen open to a page he hadn't yet seen. A crude drawing filled the center, drawn in black ink with rough, jagged lines. A group of children kneeling in a circle, a figure in robes behind them, its face a perfect void. And to the side, watching from a distance, a single boy. For 2 days after Eliot's return, he remained silent, unblinking, unmoving, and entirely uncreaturable. Father Morgan stayed close, watching the boy's every reaction or lack thereof, noting how his gaze always returned to the church, as if some part of him remained tethered to whatever had happened beneath its foundations. But on the third day, something changed. Eliot blinked, once, then again. And then he stood, no words, no questions, no expressions of hunger or pain, just slow, mechanical motion. He walked past Morgan, past his stunned mother, and into the Harper family's small den, where a wooden desk sat unused beneath a window. He pulled open the drawer, retrieved a handful of dull pencils and a thick sheaf of printer paper. Then he began to draw. At first it was silent lines, childlike and crude. But after an hour, the details sharpened. Shadows took form. Figures emerged. Morgan watched in quiet horror as the pages filled with imagery far too vivid, too specific to be random. The first drawing showed a boy kneeling on a stone floor, hands bound behind him with rosary beads, surrounded by tall candles, black candles, their wax dripping like ink. Behind him loomed a towering figure in a liturgical robe, its sleeves soaked in something dark, its face smeared into nothing. The second drawing depicted a church wall, jagged and cracked, and a man, clearly a priest, carving something into the surface, using a blade drawn across his own palm. Blood ran down the wall and pooled into a basin beneath it, where several hooded children stood, cupping the liquid in their hands. Morgan felt a chill crawl beneath his skin. These weren't dreams, they were memories. But not Eliot's. At least not from anything the boy had ever consciously experienced. Or had he? Morgan brought the Elijah journal back to the table and opened it beside the drawings. Word for word, image for image, the match was perfect. Elijah's May 19th entry had described a night where Father Callahan stood bleeding before the altar, chanting with fire around him, while we children were made to drink the blood of the wound. He flipped another page. They tied me with beads, not rope, said it was holier that way. Morgan closed the journal and stared at Eliot, who continued drawing as if in a trance, lips pressed together, shoulders tight. Each stroke of the pencil seemed fueled by something not entirely his own. Mrs. Harper, watching from the doorway, whispered, "How does he know all this?" Morgan didn't answer. He had no answer. Instead, he gently collected the drawings as Eliot completed each one, stacking them carefully. By the end of the day, there were over 20 pages, scenes of darkness, flickering light, masked faces, open books with symbols etched in crimson, and always, always, the faceless figure watching from the margins. One page, more frantic than the rest, showed the statue of the Virgin Mary split open like a door, and inside, the same hollow-eyed creature seated on a throne of thorns. Morgan could barely breathe. That night he sat in the rectory alone, the drawings spread before him, Elijah's journal open beside them, and a single phrase repeating in his mind, "It remembers through us." He flipped back to one of the earlier entries, one he had initially overlooked. When they couldn't keep it sealed, Elijah had written, they fed it instead. Mary, guilt, silence. That was the offering. If no one spoke, it stayed quiet. If someone broke the pact, the line trailed off. The next page was torn out, the pact. Morgan stood abruptly, a terrible realization forming in his chest. The boy, Elijah, had written all of this in desperation, not just to record, but to warn. And Eliot, somehow, was remembering it, not metaphorically, not through the book, through something deeper, something older. He grabbed one of the sketches, one depicting a stone room with strange lines carved into the floor, intersecting into a symbol that looked both holy and wrong. He had seen that symbol, beneath the altar, in the dust. That wasn't just a room, it was a map. Eliot's drawings weren't simply recollections, they were guides. Morgan returned to the Harper home well past midnight and found Eliot still seated at the table, now asleep, his head resting beside a final drawing. This one showed a child's eye. Just the eye, wide, terrified, and reflected inside its pupil was a door, half open, with something crawling through it. When Morgan lifted the page, he saw that the back had been scratched over with a pencil until the page tore, except in one tiny space where the words "Return" was etched. Over and over. Return. Father Morgan stood in the middle of his study, surrounded by Eliot's drawings and Elijah's journals, the candlelight casting grotesque shadows across the walls. His eyes kept returning to one particular image, a wide chamber marked with the same jagged symbol he had seen beneath the altar, drawn over and over again in both Elijah's and Eliot's visions. His breath quickened with the certainty that the true heart of whatever had infected St. Bartholomew lay directly beneath the place most sacred, the main altar. Early the next morning, before the first rays of sun broke over Woodpine's frostbitten rooftops, Morgan entered the church alone. The nave was colder than usual, its silence deeper, as though holding its breath. He approached the altar with deliberate steps, flashlight tucked beneath one arm, crowbar and pry tool in hand. The marble slab of the altar sat heavy and unyielding, but the tiled floor in front of it, once pristine, had faint irregularities that, to his trained eye, looked like a repair not noted in any record. He knelt and tapped gently. A hollow echo answered. Gritting his teeth, he inserted the edge of the crowbar into the seam of the tile and began to work. Dust puffed up with each movement, dry and acrid. It took over an hour of chipping and peeling before the final layer gave way and revealed what lay beneath. A steel plate, ancient and rusted, with a built-in ring handle, covered by centuries of secrecy. He grasped it, hesitated, then pulled. The plate gave way with a groan that sounded almost like a breath, stale air rushing up to meet him, thick with mildew and something else, something sour like rotting cloth and time. He directed his flashlight downward. A steep ladder led into darkness. Without pausing, Morgan descended. The walls narrowed as he moved downward, the air damp and heavy, the stones slick beneath his boots. After 30 lungs, he touched earth, standing inside a cavernous, underground space the size of the entire sanctuary above. But this wasn't simply a forgotten storage room. This was something older. something crafted. The chamber stretched outward in a perfect oval, walls covered in ancient brick blackened by age and mold. The floor was a patchwork of dirt and stone, and across it lay small bundles, at first unidentifiable in the dim light. As Morgan stepped further in, the beam of his flashlight revealed them. Straw dolls, dozens of them, hanging from the low ceiling beams on crude ropes, each about 2 feet tall, shaped like children, with primitive limbs, hollow heads, and stitched cloth for faces. Some were scorched, others stained, but the worst part was what was carved into each of their chests. Names. He moved closer, heart pounding, and read them aloud. Sophie L., Isaac T., Jonna C., and then, horrifically, Eliot H. Every single name matched a missing child from Woodpine's long and troubled history. Every one of them had disappeared without trace. And here they were, not in body, but in mockery. Morgan's breath caught as he looked further and saw that beneath the dolls was a pit, a shallow indentation in the earth, blackened and ringed with old candle wax. Symbols had been etched into the perimeter, many matching those from Eliot's drawings. At the far end of the chamber stood a crude altar carved from stone, different from the one above. It was lower, darker, and marked with gashes as if someone had bled upon it for years. The wall behind it bore an engraving, barely visible beneath layers of soot and dried residue. He wiped at it with his sleeve. A single phrase emerged, scratched deeply into the stone with furious precision. "Forgiveness is paid in flesh." Morgan stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. He turned toward the exit, but something glinted in the corner of his eye. Behind a loose panel of brick was a small wooden box. He opened it with trembling hands and found several more dolls, smaller, more recent. The last one had no name, only a symbol carved where the heart should be. A circle of thorn. He recognized it. It had been drawn repeatedly by Eliot in the final pages. As he reached for it, a sound echoed through the chamber. Not footsteps, not voices, but the sound of whispering, dozens of voices at once, too low to understand, yet undeniably there. He froze, heart hammering. The dolls began to sway, though no wind touched them. Father Morgan emerged from the hidden chamber beneath the altar with his heart caught in a vice, his skin clammy, and the stench of dust and ash clinging to his clothes like a curse. The dolls swaying on their strings, the names etched into straw flesh, the pit surrounded by symbols of sacrifice. It had become undeniably clear that the darkness festering beneath St. Bartholomew was neither symbolic nor ancient history. It was present. It was breathing. And it knew he had seen. That night, back at the Harper house, Morgan sat in the corner of Eliot's room, unable to sleep, a flashlight in one hand and a rosary clenched in the other. Eliot lay unmoving on the bed, eyes shut but face taut, as if his dreams were not dreams at all, but rooms he wandered unwillingly. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Eliot sat bolt upright, eyes still closed, body rigid, and began to speak. The voice that came from his mouth was not the voice of a 12-year-old boy. It was deeper, warm, heavy with something that did not belong to youth. "He forgave them," Eliot said, voice low and hoarse. "But not me, not me, not me." His head tilted upward slowly, unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible strings. Sang his name, and I watched them die in silence. That was my sin. That is why I remain. Morgan rushed forward, grabbing Eliot's shoulders. "Who are you?" he whispered, breathless. "Who are you speaking to?" Eliot's eyes fluttered, but did not open. "I told them it was too soon. The seal was weak. They broke it, and he came hungry. They knelt. They bled it. They burned. I turned away. Then, as suddenly as it began, Eliot collapsed back onto the mattress, breath slow and shallow. Mormont brought no memory. The boy awoke, groggy and silent, unaware of the words that had left his lips or the tremble in his mother's hands as she offered him breakfast. Morgan recorded the entire episode on his phone and took the file to a contact he'd met through the church's audio system. Adrian worked from a modest studio in Burlington and agreed to run a voice pattern analysis. "You sure this isn't some kind of prank, Father?" Adrian asked as he loaded the audio into his software. "I've cleaned up a lot of old sermons, but this sounds, I don't know. Haunted?" "Just analyze the voice," Morgan replied. "Compare it to this." He handed over an archival recording from 1982, one of the few remaining sermons by Father Declan Callahan, recovered from a damaged VHS and preserved digitally. Adrian synced the files, ran spectrographic overlays, and watched in real time as the patterns lined up. His face turned pale. These are almost identical. Inflection, tonality, cadence. It's the same vocal signature. The only differences come from age degradation, not origin. What are you saying? Morgan pressed. I'm saying that if I didn't know better, I'd say your 12-year-old boy is channeling a dead priest. Morgan stared at the screen, where waveforms pulsed with eerie synchronicity. Declan Callahan disappeared in 1982, he murmured. No body, no grave, just gone. Well, Adrian said, backing away slightly, if this is real, then maybe he never really left. Morgan drove back to Woodpine in silence, the road stretching endlessly beneath the overcast sky. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one of horror, ritualistic memory, lingering spirits, and a church built not just on faith but on blood and silence. That night, Eliot spoke again. Morgan was ready. He recorded every word, every breath, capturing the moment the boy sat up and began to chant, not Latin this time, but English, though the structure was unmistakably turjacket. Shadows, he waits. In silence, he feeds. One voice must carry, one soul must bleed, over and over. When Morgan played the audio back the next day, he realized something chilling. In the background, faint, nearly imperceptible, was another voice, whispering along with Eliot, not in unison, behind it, answering. He isolated the second voice and enhanced it. This time, it said something different. You brought him back. Morgan turned to the journal, flipping through Elijah's last coherent entries. One line stood out, circled in smudged pencil. He speaks through the ones who remember, and I remember too much. Eliot, who had never read this passage, was now reciting the same ideas in new words. It was more than memory. It was possession. Something was using the boy as conduit, and perhaps it wasn't just one thing. Perhaps St. Bartholomew's deepest sin had become its most powerful legacy, binding voices to brick and blood until someone heard them, spoke them, and reawakened what was meant to be sealed. Morgan sat outside the Harper house that evening, staring at the stained glass window of the church, where the Virgin Mary's eyes still seemed to follow every passer-by. Eliot remained inside, silent and still, but he would speak again. And when he did, Morgan knew it might no longer be Eliot at all. The night was unnaturally quiet, the kind of stillness that felt staged, like the world was waiting for something to begin or end. Father Morgan hadn't slept in days, his skin pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling from both exhaustion and anticipation. Eliot had grown quieter still, his mumbled words now reduced to whispers that didn't belong to him. Whispers that came from the corners of rooms even when his mouth didn't move. Morgan no longer bothered to question what was real. Reality had twisted itself so thoroughly that the line between waking and dream had long been erased. At precisely 3:00 a.m., Morgan, seated in the rectory library, with Elijah's journal open on the table before him, heard a creak that snapped him upright. The sound came again, from the nave, the sound of a heavy wooden door opening and closing with deliberate care. He raced through the hallway, barefoot, robes trailing behind him, heart pounding like ritual drums. As he entered the sanctuary, the air hit him like ice. The candles had gone out, the altar stood in shadow, and Eliot was gone. But then he heard the click, the confessional door. Without a thought, he sprinted down the aisle toward the booth. One door was ajar, the other had just slammed shut. "Eliot!" he shouted, grabbing the handle, pulling it open. Empty. The space was utterly dark, no trace of movement, no warmth left behind. The silence inside was thick, too thick. He reached in, felt nothing, then he stepped inside himself, trying to sense what had changed, what had been left. But it wasn't inside the booth that he found the answer. It was behind him. A faint sound, a whisper, not from Eliot, not from any source he could see, but from the direction of the baptismal font, tucked beneath the side alcove, where a wide mirror had been installed above the stone basin for ceremonial reflection. He turned slowly. The mirror was fogged, as if someone had breathed against it, and something was moving within it. He stepped forward, and the closer he got, the colder the air became. The reflection grew clearer, not of the sanctuary behind him, but of a room that should not have existed. In the mirror, the church appeared older, cracked, burned in places. Candles flickered dimly in the background, and then he saw himself, or what had once been him. The figure standing in the mirror wore his robes, bore his face, but the skin was pale and sagging, the beard overgrown, the eyes were leaking blood. Thick trails ran from the sockets down the cheeks, dripping into the collar. The mouth moved, muttering something repeatedly, lips slow and deliberate. Morgan stepped closer, breath caught in his throat. He pressed his palm to the edge of the font. The mirror's surface shimmered slightly. Then the reflection spoke clearly. "You opened the door," it said. "You brought them back." Morgan shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I was trying to stop it. I tried to seal it." The reflection's head tilted, the eyes widening. "You are the last. The silence ends with you." Then, for one agonizing moment, the reflection moved independently, reaching forward, touching the glass from inside. Morgan staggered back. The room went cold, and from the confessional he heard footsteps. Small, barefoot, Eliot. He turned, but the booth remained empty. The door was open. Then a voice whispered behind him, closer than breath. "Father?" He spun back toward the mirror, but the reflection was gone. The glass now showed only his own stunned face, sweating, pale, but intact. He glanced down and saw a single drop of red in the baptismal basin. Blood. He backed away, heart racing. "Eliot!" he called out again, louder this time. No response. The entire church began to hum, a low vibration beneath the floor, like something breathing just under the stone. Then the candles on the altar ignited all at once. Behind him, the main door to the sanctuary slammed shut. The air grew thick with the smell of incense and something metallic, iron, copper, blood. And then, from the pulpit, a voice called out, clear and calm. "He walks among us." Morgan turned slowly. No one stood there, but he recognized the voice. Callahan. Or what was left of him. Morgan dropped to his knees, his strength failing, his thoughts fracturing. From behind the altar, a shadow stretched outward, long and thin, reaching toward the pews. He tried to speak, to pray, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry. The rosary slipped from his hand. Then Eliot stepped into the center aisle, but he wasn't looking at Morgan. He was looking at the mirror, and in his hand, clutched tightly, was the last drawing. The one with the door half open, the thing crawling through. "It's done," Eliot said softly. Morgan crawled toward him. "Eliot, you don't have to." "It's not me anymore," Eliot whispered. Then he smiled, a small, sad smile. The floor beneath them groaned, and the sanctuary lights shattered one by one. In the mirror, the reflection had returned. This time, it wasn't alone. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more haunting mystery. We'd love to know what part of the story gave you chills, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts.